Hi and welcome to ChinnyVision. This time we're going to have some Sega arcade action with Dynamite Dux. Dynamite Dux was a 1988 arcade machine by Sega, developed by their AM2 division, running on a System 16 board, which is the same hardware used for games like Golden Axe. And indeed it is a sideways scrolling beat-em-up in some senses, except with Dux. The game was released on many of the home systems by Activision, and most of the versions we're going to see here were coded by Cord Design. Going to start off on the Atari ST. You see Bin and Pin, the two ducks there. It is a two-player game on some of these versions, the ST and the Amiga. So we see the plot of the game here. One day Lucy was playing with her pets Bin and Pin in a beautiful flower garden. Then an evil black shadow appeared. Couldn't read that. And couldn't even read all of that. It went past so fast. Basically, some baddie appeared out of nowhere, captured Lucy, and the ducks have got to go and find her. Incidentally, on the ST version here, if you type in a certain combination of words or a certain word on this title screen, it gets a bit rude, but we're not going to do that. Obviously, the code on the ST version had a slightly adolescent and puerile sense of humour. This is a map of stage 1 here, loading up on the ST. I'm playing a cracked version, so the loading may not be exactly the same as the actually released version. AY tune plays in the background, just getting my feeling of the gameplay here. The longer you hold down the fire button, the more of a punch you build up. You can also pick up weapons as you move along. You can move in 8 directions. So it's not like a game like Double Dragon where you can move left, right, up and down. You can move diagonally. In this, is Double Dragon 4? I think Double Dragon is 4 direction. Apologies if it isn't. So you've got all these different baddies and you move along the level. And occasionally there's a bigger baddie, so we're halfway through the level now, as we can see by the chart at the top of the screen. And this is the first big baddie in the Games of Fire. There's 2 water pistols there in case we're playing 2-player version of the game. All we've got to do is put the fire out. I first saw this game in Computer and Video Games, and it was the ST and Amiga versions being reviewed. And I saw it and thought, this looks amazing, I've got to get this for my Amstrad. Not having seen a review of the Amstrad version, and I've just changed over to the Amiga version, and you can see a difference here. The Amiga version has slightly better sound and a slightly larger screen. Some of the versions you can go down the steps, but not on this version. I don't think you can in the arcade version either. So there are slight differences there. Just going to check that that's definitely can't get down there. Pick up a stone there. I think there are mice running past there. Got these fox things on skateboards and these dogs. One thing you notice on some of these versions, not so much on the Amiga and ST, is sometimes the baddies, it's obvious that you triggered them when you're walking left to right, but they sometimes stop at the far left of the screen and don't go any further, which is quite odd, and I'll try and point that out if I see it. There is a 2-player version on the 16-bit versions. There's Bin and Pin. Bin is the blue one, Pin is the red one. And as with the arcade version, it's much more fun with 2 players. I'm back on the ST version now. And there is, on the 16-bit version as well, this mini-game between the levels where it's a boxing game. You can see a Colonel Sanders look-alike standing in the background there as a referee. And you just have to punch it out with the other duck. And if you win, you get bonus points. As far as I'm aware, this bonus game isn't in the 8-bit versions, or indeed the Sega Master System version. And this is level 3, and there's some jumping on this level, which can be quite annoying because on all these versions, to jump, you have to use the spacebar, and I have to reach over to press the spacebar every time I want to jump, which is a little bit annoying. Commodore 64 version actually lets you use the second joystick to jump. And it certainly hampered my gameplay here, because my setup here is basically I sit down on a beanbag with a joystick and play a game. And if I want to reach my ST or my Amstrad, especially my Amstrad actually, it's quite far away, so you have to lean right over. ST and Amiga versions are very similar. The Amiga has a larger screen. Graphics wise, they're extremely similar. Neither are as attractive as the arcade version, or as fluid as the arcade version, it has to be said. But still, there's fun to be had there. Moving across to Sega's own consoles, this wasn't ported to the Mega Drive, but it was ported to the Master System. Got the arcade music on the menu screen here, and as we go into the game, slightly odd here because you don't get the Dux originally. It looks like on this version the baddie turns Lucy's boyfriend into Dux, but there doesn't appear to be any text here explaining what goes on. So the baddie appears, he turns the boyfriend into a duck, and off Lucy goes. And I think I was saying there was a 2-player version available on the Master System. I take that back. I don't think there is. And look at the tiny sprites. Oh dear. And there's Colonel Sanders there. Unfortunately, you can't hit him. It's some kind of in-joke to do with ducks or chickens or something. I'm not sure. You have to get over how small these enemy sprites are here on the Master System. And the baddies are also quite small. Here's the fire, which is the first baddie you come across halfway through level 1. On the Master System as well, you get no indication of how far you are through the level. Essentially, the levels all follow the same pattern. There's usually a baddie halfway through and a baddie at the end, and usually a little bit that ducks down. So here, as I was showing on the other versions, you go along the top, but on the Master System, for some reason you get diverted downwards into this subway area. At least the crocodiles are normal size. It's very fluid. There's quite a bit of flickering when there's a lot going on with the sprites. Just moved on to one of the later levels here. When I first got this game last year, I played it through completely on my first go. It dishes out so many continues that you can sit here and just play the game, and after 25 minutes you've completed it. Each level has essentially the same kind of layout. The baddies get repeated, and this isn't a problem with the Master System version or any of the other conversions. It's a problem with the arcade version. The arcade version has the feel of a game which is quite repetitive. Same baddies over and over again, same end of level bosses over and over again, or same kind of bosses in similar styles. The rock baddie and the cloud baddie are extremely similar. They just, instead of hurling out rocks, the cloud baddie hurls out bolts of lightning. A lot of the criticisms of this game actually are aimed at the arcade version. I've got to say, from an arcade point of view, this is a rare misfire from the AM2 division of Sega. It wants to be a cute-em-up version of Golden Axe, but it doesn't really achieve it. Across to the Commodore 64. Slightly garish look to this. I'm sure they could have chosen a few better palettes. And we've got the expando sprites here on some of these baddies, so the pixels are twice as big as they would normally be. It does mean at least you get a very large fire sprite here. Looks slightly rude, come to think of it, on here. Just noticed that. Yeah, it does give you the larger sprites here on the Commodore 64, but they do look rather blocky. There's a bug here as well, and I'm not sure if this is a bug inherent to the original version of the game or a bug just to the image I'm playing on my C64C. I only appear to be getting one channel of the music, and if you listen very closely, the other part of the music can be heard very, very faintly in the background, similar to the problem Blood Money has on a C64C. I'm wondering if this you'd get all the music on a bread bin rather than a C64C, I don't know. Now that looks like you can go down here on this version, but I'm trying to and you can't. There's no actual physical block there, you just can't go down there. I have asked on Lemon 64 about the music and there's no definitive answer to date. This is the cloud baddie that I was mentioning. It's very similar to the rock baddie from the end of level 1. All the baddies are essentially defeated in the same way. There's usually a weapon nearby that can let you put some serious damage into the baddie, and then you usually finish them off with your fists. The exception is the fires that need the water pistol. One thing I've not been able to replicate, but I remember from playing the CPC version, and I've heard this can be a problem with some of the other versions, is sometimes the water pistol, when you're fighting the fire, when you take damage, it can be knocked off the screen. And when that happens, there's no way to defeat the baddie and you're stuck there until you lose all your lives, which can be quite frustrating. And I remember that happening with the Amstrad version, and I'm told it happens with some of the other versions as well. So we'll move on to the Amstrad CPC. Very colourful graphics here, no music. But however, we do have the chart at the top of the screen that shows us how far we are through the level. Tiny screen here on the Amstrad, but the upside is the scrolling works and isn't jerky, which is a nice change for the Amstrad. Graphics are very colourful. The palette's more faithful to the arcade version than the Commodore 64 version for sure. And there's a nice turn of speed here. I've not seen any slowdown yet when there's a lot of sprites on the screen either. I'll try and keep an eye out for that. If you pick up the hamburgers, you boost up your energy, which is useful. You've got 3 lives in the game, but you've also got the energy bar at the bottom as well, which is something I should have mentioned earlier. And the hamburgers and the pieces of cake will top that up. Like all the other versions, the Amstrad version is incredibly easy. It gives you so many continues. Now here on the Amstrad version as well, look at this, you can go along or you can go down, you've got the choice. So what I'm going to do is actually go down. But we could do either, which is unlike the Commodore 64 version and indeed the arcade version, which only let you go one way. So I don't know why there are all these differences in the versions of the game. Lots more cake to pick up there. It's a shame this game's so easy on the Amstrad, really. It really is a decent port of the game. It's repetitive, it's the same baddies over and over again, it's the same levels over and over again. But I'd much rather play this version than the Commodore 64 version. And this is the end of level 1 baddie, which is very similar to that cloud graphic we saw earlier. It's just a question of keeping on hitting him until he literally cracks up into pieces. And you see, that didn't take much effort at all. And there we are off onto level 2. This is a later level here. This is level 5. And you've got some heat-seeking missiles there. Lots of power-ups in the game. The heat seekers can be a bit annoying actually because they veer off in all sorts of directions and won't necessarily hit what's straight in front of you, which can be annoying. I don't know what those things are. Look like pies with things stuck on their nose. And here's a big star baddie. The big baddies aren't always halfway through the level. This one's a quarter of the way through the level. And it should just be a case of punching him. The trick is, as long as you're punching him, you've got your fist in the right direction, you don't take on too much damage. There was another thing here, if you notice on the Amstrad version, is that they can move in 8 directions. It can be quite difficult to discern sometimes when you're going diagonally left or diagonally right. It looks like you're going up sometimes. It's quite difficult to describe. The perspective doesn't quite work. It almost looks like you're leaning in. Moving over to the spare key, which hopefully should be similar to the Amstrad version. Possibly monochrome. Yeah, very similar. It doesn't have... Oh, the scrolling isn't quite as good as the Amstrad version. It's a little bit jerky. No music here on the 128K Specky. It's monochrome, as you expect, really. There's nice definition on the sprites, though, although I do wonder what will happen with the later levels, whether they'll change colours, because the white and the black work quite well. If they start using different colours, then it could start to be a little bit confusing, especially with these stippled backgrounds to simulate that grey. And like the Amstrad version, the fire sprite here is quite small. At least he doesn't look semi-obscene like the Commodore 64 version, I suppose. This is one of the later levels, and yes, this green colour scheme doesn't work as well. It's difficult to see some of the baddies against it. Those crocodiles there aren't too bad. There's some of the other baddies that can be difficult. And of course, we're looking at this on RGB. Imagine this on RF. So it's difficult to see that sprite there that I'm just jumping up to, and again I'm having to lean forward to my +2. So, looking at all the versions. Well, Dynamite Dux is a flawed arcade game. We've got to say that from the start. And if you're converting a flawed arcade game, you're only ever going to end up with those flaws in your conversion. So looking at the ST and Amiga, well, they're both good versions of the game. The ST doesn't have all the hardware scrolling that the Amiga has, so it has that smaller window to play in. But it's still a perfectly playable game. You don't really notice it, to be honest. The Amiga version is slightly better because you have the hardware scrolling in the larger screen. Neither of them look anywhere near as good as they perhaps could do. Certainly the Amiga version with all its colours could look far closer to the arcade than it does. Two-player is a real advantage on the 16-bit versions, however. They're both fun to play with a friend. Master System version, it's very easy. They're all easy, but the Master System is actually very, very easy because of the amount of continues. If you can't complete this game on your first go, then you're not trying. The CPC, the Spectrum and the Commodore 64, starting off with the C64, slightly ugly, I'm afraid. It's a decent stab at it on the C64, but at the end of the day, it's a little bit ugly and there's far better games to play on the C64. CPC version, very colourful, very faithful to the arcade, has a tiny window, no music. Spectrum version doesn't have the scrolling of the Amstrad version, although it does have the larger screen. Some of those latest levels have colours that could potentially be a problem. The problem with Dynamite Dux is it's a flawed arcade game. It wants to be a cute version of Golden Axe, but it fails. It just doesn't work in the arcade. Ultimately, all the versions of the game are flawed because Dynamite Dux is a flawed arcade game.